to start in exactly 1 minute, so please take your seats.
How do we change the slides?
Use this. Okay, thank you. So it's got something that looks like hi. Colin. So, I don't know whether. Yeah, so I'm just going to. Got it. My head's not really. Go, make a start. Okay, I think we're going to make a start now. So, welcome to our third panel of the day. My name is Colin Mcfarlane, and I'm based at Durham University in the UK, and I'm part of the No project as well. You've heard a lot from No already today, and a bit more now in this panel. Is this microphone okay? No? Use this one? Is this better? Yeah? Okay. Okay, so the title of our panel, as the programme says, is Reframing and Operationalizing Notions of Prosperity and Extreme Poverty to Address Urban Equality. So these are two of the key terms on the No project, prosperity and extreme poverty. So we've got four sets of speakers, four fantastic speakers. Everyone's going to speak for about 15 minutes. And we're going to move across a set of different cities, Dar es Salaam, Da Nang, Havana and Kampala. And then I'm delighted to say we've got two fantastic discussants who are going to say a few words at the end of the talks. That's Henrietta Moore, who's joining us on Skype or virtually, and also Professor Kombe from Ada University in Tanzania, who is at the front here, and he will also share some reflections at the end to help us get discussion going. And we're looking forward to hearing questions again from the floor. So I won't go on any longer than that. I'll move on to our first speakers. So our first speaker's paper title is Pathways to the Good Life, Co-producing a Contextual Understanding of Prosperity. And we've got Saffron Woodcraft from UCL, University College London, Emmanuel Usutai, who's also from UCL, Tim Ndezi here from the Centre of Community Initiatives in Tanzania, and also Festo Makoba, who's sitting next to him and who we heard from this morning. So I'm not sure which of you is starting. Yep, Tim's starting.
Thanks very much, Colin, for this introduction. We want to share with you about the piece of another work that we are doing in Tanzania. And go back. Go back. Yeah, so this is a piece about the prosperity study that we have been doing in Tanzania. The word prosperity in the context of our language, which is called Swahili, it's about maisha bora. And we had actually to sit down with the communities actually to get up the definition of prosperity. Because sometimes people consider prosperity only about money. That if somebody is prospering, they think it's about money. But when we sat down with the community, we had really got up more really understanding about the different definitions which community had. So in that picture, you see the different ranges of partners which we are drawn from different angles, from the community, from the academia, and from the local government. All of the teams were brought up together in order to analyze the understanding about prosperity. Next. So today's discussion is about how does our understanding of prosperity change when concepts are built from lived experience. And we are learning about prosperity, extreme poverty, and pathways to urban equality. So all these are the questions that this research was trying to answer. Next. Just to give you a contextual arrangement about Dar es Salaam. Dar es Salaam city is one of the major commercial business city in Tanzania. It used to be the capital, but over last few years, the government decided to shift to Dodoma. But still, Dar es Salaam is still one of the major populated city in Tanzania. And as what you could see there in the photograph is the way how the structure arrangement and household location, you really found that the large percentage of the city is informal. More than 70 to 80% are the people living in the informal settlement where they lack road networks, water, and sanitation. And actually even the poverty level is huge because majority of these people, they are being engaged in the informal kind of income generating activities. So my colleague now want to give up a sort of like a more broad contextual arrangement about the prosperity issues.
Thank you, Tim. Just to add to Tim's comments about how we're thinking about prosperity in this particular project in Dar es Salaam, but also more broadly on the comparative inquiry work work package as part of the No program. All right, I've got water, it's fine. So yeah, as Tim said, so in policy terms, but also in research terms, prosperity has been associated most closely with material wealth, definitely throughout the 20th century. So what we're trying to do with this particular project and with this work program is to kind of unsettle the idea of prosperity, so bring different voices and perspectives into research and into the production of knowledge for policy, and question what happens to our understanding of prosperity and what happens to the kind of knowledge that we can produce for policy and for governance when we start from a different point of inquiry. And our point of inquiry in this project is the lived experience of residents who are living in informal settlements. And what we want to do is think about prosperity broadly in terms of what it means to live a good life. So this morning, there was some conversation about the new global policy discourses that are flowing from the Sustainable Development Goals, from the new urban agenda. And here you can see the kind of summary of that is that prosperity in the 21st century is thinking about what it means to live But what we're trying to do with this particular work package and with the project in DAR is think about how you then operationalize these ideas. How do we make these real by putting them in particular contexts? So in this project, in 3 different settlements. Thinking about prosperity in terms of kind of research agendas, prosperity is relatively understudied compared to some of the other concepts that we've been talking about this morning. So perhaps in relation to poverty or in relation to resilience, it's a kind of concept that hasn't been explored as broadly. And much of the literature that we do have to work with focuses on the relationship between prosperity in material terms and standards of living and livelihoods at an aggregate level. So we tend to think about prosperity in national terms or in regional terms. But what we're trying to do here is kind of localize the inquiry and think very much about differences within cities, differences within communities, and then what that kind of grounded starting point can tell us about wider citywide dynamics. So the methodology that we're using, we call the Prosperity Index. So this is a methodology that the Institute for Global Prosperity has developed and tested in a number of different locations, in Beirut, in Kenya, in London, and now working with CCI, adapting it for a very different context to where we've worked previously. And this is a kind of step-by-step methodology, mixed methods, that is focused on explicitly on working directly with communities to conceptualize and collect data, but also to build their capacity as we go through the different steps in the process. So starting with a very grounded, qualitative, contextually specific exploration of what prosperity means, and then developing that into different research tools that can be brought into policy making and governance. So you can see here, these are the different kind of steps in the process. I'm going to hand over to Festo now, who's been leading the community co-production work, and he's going to talk about what we've been doing practically for each of these different steps.
Thank you, Saffron and team. I will start with the research, which we started with first identifying the research team that will be involved in correcting the data. As I mentioned in the previous sessions, normally in our team, community research teams, we have people from the community, we have people from the government at different level, we have people from NGOs and graduates from universities. Why we are doing this is from the experience that we learned that when you want to co-produce something, especially with the government officials, you have to be keen on the level of involving them. You have to involve them from the scratch, being in the starting point of narrating the problems. It's through experience that we had when you correct the data with the communities and you take them to government officials. Normally, sometimes they don't trust the data from the community. So what we learned is to engage them from early at the beginning. So from the data collection, in the planning, and other stages. So in our teams, we normally have those members from communities, government from ward level up to sub-ward level. After identifying the team that will be involved in the research, we take now in another step of training. For example, if you can see the second picture from the left, I think it's the right-hand side, it's a session of brainstorming all the team together to come up with the proper words to be used in the research. Then from there, what we did is to come up with our own model that will be used to guide us or to measure what a good life, the quality of life for people who are living in former settlements of Dar es Salaam. So that was the follow-up activity that we did. So the next three, which are in red color, those are the pipeline activity that we are aiming to start with. So after identifying the models, together with the community and government officials, we'll now set some indicators that will be used to measure, and then we'll conduct the household survey, and lastly will be activity of building a prosperity index for Dar es Salaam. Another picture which shows the process, how it was very engaging. All stakeholders who were in the research teams set together to develop that model that will be used to measure the Maisha Bora for people who live in Dar es Salaam. Okay, so the previous picture was the process of developing this model. So this is the model that they came up with. So you can see there is some other sign, but those 5 bubbles are 5 major things that people want to come up with a good life. So it's like a chain of good life for people who lives in Dar es Salaam. Okay, for example, in prosperity, the major thing for people to live a good life is the foundation of prosperity. So the community, they came up with the symbol of a house. That a house is something that everyone, you must live in, whether it's a good house or bad, but you have to have a house. So that's a foundation of a good life. So the another thing was opportunity and aspiration. People, they found that it's like a star. They come up with that symbol of star. That there are other, things that contribute to live a good life as an opportunities and sometimes aspirations. But another thing which they came up with was the power and voice. So they used the symbol of fingers or a hand. Another thing was like belonging or identity or culture. That people, they come up with a picture of love. So there are other things that also contribute for people to live a good life to up to the last, which is the health and the healthier environment for people to live a good life. So that's a model that we developed in November last year. Okay, I hand over to
So it's just a very, very brief description of a methodology that's actually taken a lot of work with a very large research team. And the model that Festo just presented was based on in-depth qualitative work that the community researchers collected themselves. So having designed the questions and thought about how to plan the data, they then went to collect the data in order to build that model together. So just to close then, we just wanted to give some reflections on what we think we're learning about prosperity and its relationship to extreme poverty. It's very early days in the work, and there's still a lot of thinking to do. But we were really struck by how prosperity and Maisha Bora, in the way that the communities were talking about it, was not just an inverse of poverty. So there's not just a direct kind of binary relationship between addressing poverty and reducing poverty and then increasing prosperity. And that kind of emerged because the way that people talked about prosperity was not just in economic terms. You can see from the model that it's multidimensional. And the idea of the foundations of prosperity is very strong. So it's like these are the things which are absolutely critical for you to build a prosperous life upon. But just having the foundations in place themselves are not enough to constitute having prosperity. So it's a much more complex picture. Kind of related to that, we felt that this methodology has helped us to identify kind of citywide dynamics. So thinking about informality and thinking about insecure livelihoods, but it's also enabled us to build kind of case-specific and population-specific insights about the dynamics of how these kind of factors interrelate. And it's having those dynamics, the insights on those dynamics, that then enables us to have a conversation with the community and with policymakers about pathways and interventions that can follow. Just very briefly, we felt that co-production has obviously been a critical part of this, but the co-production of knowledge by itself is not sufficient to kind of bring about transformative action. Next slide. So we've been thinking about how we conceptualize pathways to urban equality, and there's kind of 3 steps emerging. So the first being the co-production of actionable knowledge, but the second being the recognition that that knowledge alone is not sufficient. that we also have to build frameworks and tools to enable that knowledge to be kind of embedded in decision-making processes. And then the third is to think about how those frameworks and structures for decision-making can evolve into governance structures. So giving the community, or giving communities and decision-makers the tools to co-produce interventions and then hold those decision-makers to account. And I know that we're over time, but I just wanted to make one more point, which I think is quite important. So we were discussing yesterday about the kind of professional environment that planners and policymakers work in, and how in cities like Dar that can be quite volatile in the sense that people are moving on quickly, there's a lot of population, kind of professional population churn, so the kind of sustaining knowledge that's created can be very challenging. And having tools like this that the community can own the process of and manage the data is a way to kind of mitigate some of those issues. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Festo, Saffron, and Tim, for that fantastic presentation. We've got, as we switch presentations, a moment for a quick question, if anyone has one. I can see first hand in the air there. So do you want to ask a quick question just while we're changing over?
Good afternoon. So I think this was like alluded to in the very last bit of the presentation, where you're saying that there is this conflict about sustaining professional knowledge. So I'm a student in this field, but I wanted to ask as to, so there are a lot of policy advocacy and policy making institutions that come up with, and there are funding institutions that are coming up with projects for creating certain kinds of cities, and they have certain indices in mind. So disability friendly cities, etc., sustainable cities, and they have these, and these funding institutions want to bring forward an idea of an inclusive city, and so they're trying to create these various indices. How do you and then these institutions are working with cities, with different cities in a country, and they're trying to take it down to the lower levels of the government. So how do you place all these, and these are overlapping indices, right? So how do these cities that are at the local level, how do they work with these multitude of indices that overlap, and they're trying to do the same thing, but there are different institutions making them do the same, somewhere the same thing.
Just to respond to that very quickly, I suppose what we're trying to do with this index is produce a form of knowledge that comes from a very different place. So the kind of indices that you're talking about, and there are a lot of them, tend to be produced by experts, whether they are city policymakers or academics, or so they're led by specific institutions. And what we're trying to do here is flip that around and produce. So I produced research that identifies priorities from a different perspective. And if you start from a different perspective, you'll inevitably end up with different kinds of measures and metrics. And we probably don't have time to go into it in too much detail. But we also work with, the Institute for Global Prosperity also works with indices at other levels too. So there's a way that they can be complementary, but this is a different starting point. So it's a community-led vision of what Maisha Bora is in Dar es Salaam that will be quite different in terms of being able to measure the dynamics than something that is expert-led.
Thank you, Saffron. I know that Tim and possibly Festo want to come back on that, but maybe we'll leave that to the final discussion, just in the interest of time. So we're going to move on to our second presentation, which is on the slides now. A study on the fishing communities of Da Nang City, with special focus on assessing local assets and resources. And it's going to be Trang Phan from Da Nang Architecture University and Trin Chu from Cham Island MPA. So I'm not sure which of you is speaking first.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Trang from Da Nang, Vietnam. So I would like to introduce to you our project, a study on the fishing community in Da Nang City, focusing on the local access and resources to improve the livelihood of fishing village under the context of rapid urbanization. So, first of all, I would like to give you some brief introduction about the city brief and the research. Da Nang City is one of the most developed city in Vietnam, which has a very long and beautiful coastal line with a fishing ground of 15,000 square kilometers. And in recent years, this city focused on developed to be a modern city, and they really are concerned about the economic growth. So it is a reason why they have some problem with the balance between the economic growth and preservation of traditions and history. Actually, in 2015, the SDG was introduced to Da Nang City, and they agreed to sign a commitment to join into the SDG program in Vietnam. But until the 2017, they quit that commitment because they think that they need to focus on the economic growth. And the fishing village, which is strongly tied with the establishment of the history of the city, but now they are considered like a problem related to the livelihood and the poverty rather than to be a potential potential force of the city possibility. And in recent years, most of there are very few research on the local access and resource of the fishing village. It is the reason why in this project we have three objectives. The first objective is to co-identify the fishing village community in Da Nang City and read their status using the indicator related to fishing, fishermen, and fishing community. The second objective is to uncover and assess the local assets to empower the fishing village. And the third one is to determine together with the community group if any improvement can be made. And in this presentation, we just focused on the first objective because we just finished it and we are just moved to the second one. So I just introduced very quick about the methodology. The first one is we try to identify the study area. In Vietnam, we have about 17 coastal world. Sorry, in Da Nang, we have about 17 coastal world, and we are trying to figure out there are 16 fishing village in Da Nang. It is a difficult step because of even though we work with the local community, they are confused if there are any fishing village in their area. So it is very difficult to get the data related to fishing village in Da Nang. And we try some data collection method like repeat assessment, semi-structure with the local community, assess-based community development and community mapping, and ABCD and community mapping. Dr. Jun will introduce you in detail later. So some preliminary reason we've got, like the first is the historical landmark of fishing village in Da Nang. And actually in Da Nang we can find 16 fishing village which were established from the century 15, 17, 19 and 20th century. But the interesting thing is that most of the fishing village which are still quite well remain now are established in 15th and 17th century. And in 19th and 20th, they nearly wipe out. You can see on the map the scale of the fishing village in the flourishing period. And currently, the scale of the current fishing village are downsizing so much. So we can see that the urbanization affects to the life of the coastal resident and lead to the transition of livelihood pattern, and the village structure and the community linkage have been disrupted. So here the table shows the number of fishing households in Da Nang fishing village. The scale and the distribution of fishing among the fishing village is uneven. You can see here in Tho Quang fishing village, which are invested by the government to become an industrial and service zone of the fishery and pork. They have a lot of like fishermen focusing here. And in the rest of the other fishing village, they nearly in very small scale. And here, because of the policy of the government, they just encourage the high capacity and high technology vessel. So you can see the light blue line is the high vessel, high technology vessel is increased, and the rest of the small scale vessel, they decrease a lot. And it affects deeply into the fishermen who are in the small fishing village. However, because of this policy, so the fish yield in Da Nang City is quite sustainability because of the high technology of the fishery. Sorry. But when you look into the monthly fisherman income, you can see an inequality between the fishermen. You can see that in Tho Quang, which are invested by the government, and the Mung Thai is invested by the government. It has a very high salary, high income, and the rest of the fishing village, they has very low income and is very unstable, and their livelihood is unstable too. Sorry. And when we mention we do the survey about the working age of fishermen, the inequality is not only among the fishermen themselves, but also between the fishermen and the people working in other industry, because fishing is dangerous, and it's not like encouraged by it's not like a high level of the class in Vietnam. So the young generation, they don't want to join in this job, and they try to do some other job. And you can see from young generation here, there's mostly no young people who working in the fishing village. It makes a big challenge for the fishing because of there is the absence of the next generation. And based on that survey and data, we try to set the criteria for classification, because based on the classification, we can make a suitable, to propose a suitable solution to work with the community, fishing community. So we have a 5 level based on the fishing village structure, the number of fishermen, the fishing ground, the convenience of accessibility, traditional culture, and the possibility to develop. So we have a 5 level like this, and you can see the map here. So in the map of fishing village in Da Nang, we can see just some of the fishing village still quite well remained here, and many other fishing villages are nearly wiped out. And now we move to the discussion about the result, and Mr. Jun will help me to do that.
So, okay, when I work with the architect university, they asked me how to get them involved with the community. Because after the research, you can see they have a lot of things. Because when the city, they always ask prosperity, they talk about that. But in fact, when we do that, we see that the community, especially for the local people, the fishermen, they almost be out because of the planning. You can see that's one. They have a traditional fishing area, and then traditional fishing here. And a long time ago, you look at the history, that the city is developed by the fishing activity, right? And when they developed it, they say that it's tourist activity, tourist the city. But they put all the traditional out, right? And then where the fishermen? And when you do research in the fishermen is not here. So when we discuss with them, we want to know where they are now and what they have. When they know what they have, by the hand, the head, and the heart, and then we connect with some other. So we get the first one is a partnership. We get a partnership between different stakeholders in the community, and different the community and between the government and private sector and scientists and local people. That is we discuss with the community. If we get this one, and then the prosperity will go back for the city, and then the fishermen, they will go back for the city. So what we go to do no for next? Okay, all right. That is okay. From this one, okay, we go back for the high traditional village here. Now we go to help the local community here, right? They have enough capacity to develop this village first. And then the second one, that is very close to the development of the tourists. So we connect between the traditional knowledge here with the tourism. And then two locations, we try to help them, right? And then local people, they can help, they can develop and they can survive by the knowledge and then skill and some other thing here. So that by developing of the two community of fishermen here, and then we will connect to the fishermen in the city. So that is already in plan for the tourism development. Some other fishing area here, we will work with the tourist operator, right? How the tourist operator, they use the knowledge of local people. That is something we can share benefit between the private sector and the local people. So that is the first phase. We try to help them by discuss with the community, with the city, and then with the network. And that we hope with it. So why we have very confidence to have a deep plan? Because outside this city, we still have a conservation surrounding Quang Nam and Hue, and then Quang Ngai. That is already successful in the conservation to develop by the ecotourism. So by this connection, and we hope we will get the fishermen back to their community. We will get the knowledge, traditional will be back in their community. We will get the partnership back, sharing benefit between different stakeholders, especially with the private sector and local community and the government, and also the scientists. So that is the plan. So our project will just started 1 year. So the next year, we will work with the community, we will work with city to go further, and then we hope we will get this one. And together with that, we develop a monitoring program and some other things. And then I hope we, at the end of the next year, that is second year, we will have a whole that data to present the final, and then we take the lesson learned from this research. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Trin. Okay, there's a quick question. We'll take it before we move on to the next one. Otherwise, we'll just... I don't see any hands, and probably for the interest of time, we'll just keep moving. So our third presentation is moving to Havana, and we've got Jorge Pina and Jocelyn Casanave at the end there. Well, not at the very end, Schweib's at the very end. And those guys are going to take us through the title of Addressing Urban Inequality in Havana, Interrogating the Prosperity Perspective.
So good afternoon. So good afternoon, everyone. We are going to make a presentation that was actually prepared by 3 of the members of a much larger group that has been working in Havana on these topics. But today, Joyce and I are here. I'm going to be the one that is going to be talking the most. So the presentation is taking into consideration a very special context. As it was mentioned before, Havana has just celebrated 500 years of foundation. It was a particularly important moment because it was accompanied by somehow the entrance into a completely new stage of the urbanization process. The evidence of that has to do with a process of transformation that is referred to changes taking place particularly in the last 4 years. If we take a look back to the dynamics related to equality and prosperity, which are the main topics of this presentation, we can see that there is a particular change in the fact that between 1959 and 1989 there was a process of systematic elimination of unjust conditions and an effective promotion of equality, sometimes confused with sameness. Whereas from 1989 onwards, after the collapse of the socialist system bloc and the strengthening of the US blockade against Cuba, there was a forced rupture in the logics of equality generation and a focus on equity. Equality appears as an important component of the reality. A milestone in the current situation has to do with the fact that also in 2019, yes, it was approved the new constitution, which opens up a completely new setting for the Cuban society and was preceded by changes that started to take place in 2011. In that period, from the 1989 onwards, there was established a reform that has mainly two phases. The second one particularly has been very intensive in terms of changes of the situation in Cuba in general, because new old actors started to prevail in the societal scene, and particularly, for example, the market acquires a completely new role, a stronger role. So, accompanied by important documents that are defining the roadmap of the society for the next years, new opportunities started to appear for the development of the country, but also an increase of the social inequalities. And at the same time, the term prosperity emerges in the policy sphere. What are the tensions in this context? Well, the tensions are related precisely to the contradiction between prosperity and equality. On the one hand side, there is an urgency for economic growth. There are alternatives that are also conflicting inside of this intention, but at the same time, there is an increase of the social inequalities expressed particularly in Havana with some kind of new social spatial differentiation. Notwithstanding, it's always important to highlight that in spite of all these elements, Cuba continues to be one of the countries with the lowest or smallest Gini coefficient. You can see in this graphic the difference in comparison to many other countries. So, they matching the political sphere and the citizen sphere, and at the same time to identify prosperity pathways towards urban equality. For that, we have used as an approach the so-called embedded case. This is a transdisciplinary approach, which means that there is an interaction between different levels, including the local population, and there are mainly three phases that we have identified in this process. The first one, the definition of a preliminary prosperity model, which is a critique to the study we made of international models of prosperity, such as the CPI, the Legatum Institute model, and also the analysis of the experiences of the colleagues of the IGL in London. And from that, we made an initial proposal of this preliminary model. Afterwards, the aspiration is to create an initial system representation of this case, and as part of this interrogation to get to a final representation of this system. So this model starts to reflect, for example, variables that are different to the other ones. For example, in many of these previous analyses, health appears in a very prominent way. For Cuba, this, however, is not a so relevant element because it's actually already achieved a very high standard in that area. So a key element of the analysis is precisely this idea of interrogating this initial model through through different perspectives. On the one hand side, the academic production, what is happening in the regulatory framework, what is happening at the political level, but also what is happening in the communities that we are working with. And the aspiration is precisely that this already achieved some partial or preliminary results. For example, it is very clear that at the political level, it is prominent the fact that this phrase of prosperous and sustainable socialization has become an important motto in our reality. For instance, a very recent tweet of the president of the country was precisely highlighting on the other hand side, in the organizational sphere, we can see that there is some kind of mismatch between what is going on with tools such as the new Cuban urban agenda or the planning tools, where there is still a lot of room for a more thorough coverage of both issues related to prosperity and equality concerns. There is a level that is still missing. It's going to take place during the next 2 years and is related precisely to the case studies that we are conducting within the NO project. These are 4 areas in different specific urban situations of the city that are talking about the diversity of the urban situation of Havana. And what is interesting here is that we are using the same spaces in which visions for the transformation of these communities, and so we have as an aim to have an impact in the trajectories of these communities. And at the same time, we are using these spaces in order to obtain more information, more evidence of what are these notions of prosperity. And at the same time, the aspiration is to have these visions with these notions of prosperity embedded inside of it. What is interesting at the same time is what is happening with this academic exploration. As a matter of fact, the term prosperity has not been thoroughly explored in the Cuban context. Other terms such as well-being, local development, social development has been more prominent. And actually, in journal articles, the presence of this term is almost inexistent. Only a few authors have started to address the term recently. For example, Triana, making reference to this prosperity and sustainable socialism approach, highlights that there is a very little understanding of prosperity. Other author, like Mayra Espina, for example, is talking about the challenges that the increasing poverty and at the same time the social inequality is posing, and the appearance of a new economic class within the country. It is also interesting how it is also analyzed the lack of explicitity in the political documents about what this prosperity means, and at the same time the fact that this is having an impact in the perception of prosperity by the population in different realms. Moreover, it is interesting the analysis that is brought by Mayra Espina as well, when she highlights that the fact that there is such a clear statement from the political sphere and the lack of evidence of the analysis in the academic realm poses a very strong challenge to the current situation, and particularly to the social sciences. So, right now we are precisely in the moment of identifying out of this initial model, this initial interpretation of the system, topics that are to become or are to be read as pathways of prosperity for urban equality. They are reading their reality, they are being worked out with different actors, and it's precisely our aspiration to continue these explorations that were started with the preliminary model, also with this, in order to reach a final interpretation of the system in which we reach a more thorough understanding of what prosperity means for our situation, with the intention of translating this new knowledge into existing practice. So finally, I just wanted to highlight the fact that as we talk here, in our country there is a tremendous tension because the pressure that the US blockade is putting in Cuba is precisely hindering the capacity of our society to reach these aspirations of prosperity and equality. But there is a fact, a promising fact, that the new constitution, the new political and socioeconomic setup is bringing completely new opportunities for our society. So now is trying precisely to make a contribution in this space.
Excellent, thank you, Hoy. Again, as we move over, any quick questions? Actually, it's a kind of post-lunch atmosphere to the people's participation. Okay, we'll move on to our final paper, and then we're going to have time for discussion at the end, and we've got two great discussants to help wake us all up from the post-lunch effect. Shwai Blawasa, Makerere University in Kampala, is going to be our final presentation. His title is Understanding Shocks, Poverty and Inequality in Kampala.
Hello? Yeah, it's working. Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm going to present on behalf of the entire team, all of whom are here, Teddy, Hafisa, and Judith, who are part of the ongoing study on understanding shocks, poverty and inequality in Kampala. You may notice that we do not actually use the word extreme poverty. That is because of partly what we have analyzed and presenting in here today, but also our previous historical understanding of conditions of poverty in Kampala and in Uganda. Yeah, by way of kind of giving a background to this talk, which should be relatively short, is that there's been observation of increasing inequality in cities. If you look at the UN Habitat Cities Report, African Cities Report, it states that, and a couple of other researches. Well, what is key is that in the literature and national documentation, there is always a focus on national inequality and not so much on urban inequalities. And that is because when you look at the regional statistics, it's often indicated that at regional level, and that obscures the spatial differentiation of poverty at urban level. And that is partly the reason that there isn't that much attention about urban poverty, the urbanization of poverty and inequality in cities, including Uganda. And then you also have this challenge of city jurisdictional boundaries within which there's a definition of urbanization of poverty and conditions of well-being, but there's also this functional regional city or city region where there is a kind of a seamless interaction between the core city and the immediate area around it, and there is a lot of similarities in respect to poverty conditions, but also shocks that happen. In this particular study, our focus is on socio-economic shocks as well as biophysical shocks. We've had quite good discussions among ourselves as a team, but also within the wider Urban No team. And in November, we had a very nice week-long workshop where we got input from some of the members of Urban No who are here. And we expanded the study to also include urban shocks building on also previous work in the Urban Action Lab that we've done on climate variability, so to bring the into the post-2015 issues in respect to well-being and prosperity. In this particular study, we have three main objectives. One is to try and understand the spatial distribution of poverty and characterization of that. The other is to also investigate the influence that, of shocks on inequality over time and over space, because we know that this is a very dynamic process. Shocks or epochs of these different socioeconomic and biophysical shocks occur in not so much a regular sequence of pattern, but over time there are differences there. And the third objective is to try and understand the relationships between socioeconomic and biophysical shocks, looking at the possibilities for bidirectional interactions between socioeconomic and biophysical, and how either state reinforces the other within the city. We are trying to get our heads around some kind of framing for these shocks, and this is an adopted framing from CIDA about equality and the several dimensional determinants and drivers of urban equality, from politics and institution, conflicts, economic, social context, but also environmental context, and how different dynamics of power, resources, access to resources, human security and opportunities actually play out to influence and determine how is influence and determine the conditions of the shock experiences and magnitude, but also inequality within the cities. So this is work in progress, as I mentioned earlier, and we'll say how to do that. So there are a couple of definitions which I believe I won't have to take you through in much more detail, but the key concepts here is poverty in terms of deficiencies in necessities of human survival and welfare, and then the shocks are the kind of spikes and events that happen, whether social in nature, or economic nature, or biophysical, on daily basis. So it's very much speaking to the everyday notion, not this time on risk, although I saw one of the slides in panel 1 on poverty risk, so that was really very striking. And this could be biophysical, it could be social economic, and then our understanding, initial definition of inequality as unevenness in distribution of opportunities and resources across services across the city. So this is where Kampala is located. We don't have a map at the moment for Africa, but it's in East Africa, and Kampala is right at the Lake Victoria shores, and this is the bigger city region. But the jurisdiction of Kampala city is this dark shaded area in the middle, but there are other municipalities within the city region. And in terms of infrastructure, services, in terms of similarity for social conditions across the city region, we thought that it would be useful to really understand these dynamics if we took the city regional approach. And the kind of methodological approach that we are applying, we have done a review of literature so far, not yet conclusive at the moment, but we've worked mainly with the census data on poverty and income, but also social services, which is actually going to inform the next slides that are main part of this presentation. And we've also access to Act Together or SDI of Uganda, slum profile data, which is useful. So we are yet to delve deep into these profiles of the different slums to interrogate the issues. And we've applied a spatial approach to spatial differentiation of inequality and poverty, and that is the grading. And we hope to continue with the study with lived experiences using mixed method approach with participatory video, but also qualitative approaches. We are thinking about a number of things to do there, including constructing narratives around household level scenarios for shocks in different hotspot areas. So this is the city region, and these are the kind of preliminary results and discussion about the characterization objective one, which we so far we have focused on. This is the gridded population, so it just shows the distribution of the population. But what is important to remind ourselves is that this is the city proper, and the city region there. And as you can see, just around the central business districts, that's where you have a concentration of the population. And that can go up to 55,000 people per maybe hectare or something like that. And then within the census data, we use the census data and the Gini coefficient information to analyze the kind of hotspots using looking. Possibly we need to investigate that further. The proportion of people living below the poverty line is quite high. We also use some other indicators from the census data, including access to public facilities, particularly primary schools and health facilities. So this is again an indication of the spatially differentiated access to health facilities. And this map shows the proportion of people that have access to a health facility within 5 kilometers. So one key highlight of this is that even within the city region, minus the almost white region here, you still have pockets within Kampala capital city jurisdiction or boundary that have access to health facilities beyond 5 kilometers. And now we're using 5 kilometers because it is standard in Uganda, so it is considered to be the first level spatial access to health facilities. So if you're within 5 kilometers, you expect it to be okay compared to many others who have to walk or travel several kilometers to access the health facilities. And on the right-hand side is beyond the 5 kilometers, and that kind of squares out many of the parishes or areas within the city, so there is more access to, if it is beyond 5 kilometers. The next map illustrates access to public schools. Some previous work that we did on urban natural assets and ecosystem services. So the map you see on this slide on the right-hand side actually illustrates the remnants of natural assets or patches from which you can derive particular ecosystem services. So that is also going to be integrated with the poverty and other socio-economic characteristics. And this is going to be the next steps. We'll investigate the temporal influence of shocks, and we hope to do that using surveys, but also lived experiences and participatory video. And then we shall proceed with investigating the interrelationship between socioeconomic and biophysical shocks, and which is why this map features here. That is the best map or the fundamental layer for ecosystem services and natural assets within the city. We all know how important it is to live within neighborhoods that can actually regulate air quality. And if you have natural assets that are shrinking or dwindling or degraded, then air quality tends to be problematic or very low in cities that are also very much reliant on fossil fuel modes of transportation and industrial use. And this is the last slide, so I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you, Schweib. That's great. So we've had four really rich presentations, lots of ideas and lots of issues to talk about and think about. Before we have a more general discussion, I just want to pass over to our discussants, who one of them is online. I don't know, is Henrietta available at the moment, David?
Yes, hi, Colin.
Should we kick off with Henrietta? So Henrietta and Professor Combe at the front here, they're going to give a short set of reflections, and then it will be open to the floor. In the meantime, any questions for Schweib? No. I'm sure they're not coming. All these questions are coming. Sometimes a flood of questions. Oh, there was one, sorry. Go on, please.
Thank you for an excellent presentation, Schweib. One question, and I'm sorry if I missed it. When you were looking at income inequality and then looking at distances from public facilities as a way to measure access, is there any work that you're aware of that actually overlays the two? So you know from the income data or the Gini coefficient data where those people are spatially located, and then mapping that to health facilities to get, it's a different picture, but is there anything that you're attempting to do on that?
I did mention that we're thinking about the approach that DAI is using, and this is where we will have a spatial integration of income inequality with access to other services and even the natural assets. So we have an idea of how to do it in the GIS environment, but we are yet to concretize on that. So it would be really very useful. So, but at the same time, some of these maps, the data is also very much having in the background the administrative boundaries. So we know, I didn't just show it, this is why the summarized table actually indicates the different areas and the slums where poverty conditions are measured spatially.
Thanks, Schweib. Okay, we're going to move over now to Professor Henrietta Moore from University College London, Institute of Global Prosperity.
Good afternoon, everyone. Colin, can you hear me well?
We could do with a little bit more volume. We're just going to make you a little bit louder, Henrietta.
See if we can do it.
Yeah, perfect.
Right. Is that better? Yes? Okay, good. I can now hear myself, but never mind. Anyway, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for a set of marvellous papers. I'm very sorry not to be with you in person, but I'm delighted to have an opportunity to make a small contribution. I think what all the papers do from the prosperity angle is to focus on the importance of redefining what we mean by prosperity in the 21st century. And I think actually this is a global problem. We know that it's not enough simply to talk about increases in GDP. As everyone often says in Africa, we can't eat GDP. It's also not enough to talk about inclusive growth if by inclusive growth we only mean inclusive markets. And I think the work on Da Nang really focused our attention on that particular point. Now, starting with the lived experience of communities has to be the jumping off point, the starting point for work on prosperity, I think. But as the presenters on the Tanzanian work said it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition. And this is because we have to deal at the policy level with various kinds of issues of scale. And here I think we look at the way in which all 4 countries that we have been discussing today have been engaging with multiple stakeholders, and how multiple stakeholders are key in this process because of a diversity of perspective, not just a diversity of voices, but a diversity of perspective. And bringing those diverse perspectives together provides a different space for those voices in a new kind of complex ecology. And when that complex ecology is allied to new kinds of toolkits, I think we can begin to really make progress. When we think about prosperity in the policy sphere, we've been doing, and I know the other teams have been doing it too, and that is tracking the shifting understandings of prosperity in the policy sphere, and indeed in the general international discourse on economic structural and social transformation. And that's an important thing to do, not just because it's very often been the case that these national and city-led policies don't actually begin with the lived experience of residents and therefore miss much of what is important. But it's particularly important because we don't currently at the moment have a very convincing account of economic structural transformation for the 21st century. In structural transformation we've been working with for the last 50 years are thoroughly inappropriate for the 21st century and don't work. And this means that when we're looking at how do we tackle urban inequality, how do we tackle extreme poverty, what do we mean by resilience, what do we mean by sustainable pathways to prosperity, we have to recognize that the undergirding assumptions of much of the work that was done, for example, to going forward in the 21st century. This, I think, is particularly important when we can see things that we would not be able to see otherwise. And here, particularly when we compare Tanzania, Vietnam, and Cuba, we see that all of these countries and all of the cities involved are at different points in what was thought to be a trajectory of economic and social transformation from the 21st century, and that we can't really understand what's happening in those countries and cities at the moment using the current tools that we have. The last point I might like to make is that I think that the Ugandan paper here was very useful and backed up by the paper on Da Nang also, in thinking about not just the importance of public services as a framing device for understanding some of the concerns of prosperity for citizens, but also the importance of natural assets. So those are the things that came first to mind when hearing those very rich papers this afternoon, and I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to make a few comments. So thank you.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you, Henrietta. That's really helpful. We're going to have our final speaker as discussant, Professor Combe. Are you ready to roll? Yep. All right. Can she hear me now? Okay. Henrietta, you were on mute, so we're just saying thank you again for your really helpful comments.
Thank you very much, colleagues. And for me, really, it was a learning process because of the diversified nature of Thank you. Now, I was saying that for me, the presentations were quite informative and the learning process, and indeed quite diversified because of the context, which are very different. And I think I take the cue from the colleague who was commenting, and particularly wanting to know better the underlying assumptions of understanding prosperity in these countries, and because the contexts are quite different, and that prosperity locally, nationally, and regionally is framed by a number of variables. And I think it's important to make assumptions which I missed in the presentations, which were also in the equality context. What assumptions are really framing these ideas, taking into account the diversified nature of the context. And then I was also wondering, when I was listening around and trying to look at my own country, and saying that, yes, public services is a very important attribute of measuring inequality in any country, many countries. But in our country, especially in the global south, that is the major responsibility of the state, to provide, to deliver adequate basic service, at least to facilitate. But when you have weak state or weak governance systems, I think it's important to interrogate that, to find out whether the fundamentals of governance can be met in such a situation, essentially a service delivery, which can take into account those weak or rather unexpected events in governance. And this I also add in the sense of the colleagues in Tanzania when they are talking about prosperity. Does this notion of prosperity, is it changing with the governance systems in the country? Is it static? Because when I look at prosperity during Nyerere's time, we are talking about health, education, and what? Afya, utawala bora, and governance. Those were the aspects which were supposed to lead us towards prosperity. When I look at what followed later, the market, Mwinyi's time, that was the market which was supposed to lead us to a prosperity. More or less, Mkapa regime, Kikwete, more or less the same. Now we are going back to I don't know where we are, but I think we are going back somewhere. And I'm saying that, does this really matter? Because I didn't find interesting debate in this area. Does it matter whether you have a different system of governance which does not necessarily blend with the prosperity ideas of the community? And this is very important for us in Tanzania, because you can see already where we are in terms of whether we are focused on the public services or macro economic development trends. The other thing which I wanted to share with a colleague from Vietnam was essentially the issue of the power relations. You are talking about the trying to empower the fishermen, the traditional fishermen, in an environment which is highly market. Where do you find the room for maneuver in such a situation? Because when you talk about that, when I'm trying to imagine my own country, fishermen are being gradually displaced off by the market. And they have very little power and the ability to resist these transformations. Where do you find the room for maneuver in such a situation where the market are so strong and there are vested interests of very politicians, academics, business people? These are not only multinational fishing companies, they have a lot of local networks which have vested interest. And I was just wondering what are you using to influence or to be able to maneuver space of change in such a situation in the case of Vietnam? I would have liked to get a bit of that one. Essentially, those were my comments, but I think one of the cross-cutting issues which I thought was very important was also to reflect upon what is happening on the national reports on these aspects. When I look in Tanzania, I was expecting that the annual report on the social, economic, and housing report, which are produced every 2 years. I think that would tell us something about prosperity, about trends and poverty, and we are trying to look at that also and see whether you can compare the past two reports of the past 3-4 years to see where are we going, and therefore whether the definition which is coined, contextualized is really fitting or is blended with these general trends. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kombe. Professor Kombe from Ardley University in Tanzania. So I know that the panelists will want to speak and have responses to those comments from the discussants, but I'd like to open it up now for questions, comments, reflections from the audience. Who wants to kick us off? There's Vanessa. I always count on Vanessa.
Can we conceptualize? Sorry, is this? I would invite the speakers to conceptualize the discussions, particularly on prosperity, although I think there's some relevance to the theme of poverty as well, in the context of sustainable development and climate change, and how we can think about, for example, a community definition of resilience when we have a city that is transforming and perhaps losing elements of resilience that they already have from the natural resources of the city and so on.
Thank you very much for very stimulating presentations. One, I wanted to ask the panelists about prosperity. Is prosperity a universal concept? Is prosperity something that is inherited in the discussions in the places you've been working on? Some would argue that, for example, the concern of justice and equality, it's something that is universal. The way it's understood is very different in different places, but they strive towards justices. Now, how do you feel the concept of prosperity? Something that you see present in a different context and then it's understood in a different way? Or is it, if it's not universal, then I think that the notion of the good life was also presented as alternative concept. So what is your perspective around the universality of the concept versus its situateness? And secondly, for the Tanzania team, I was very interested to hear how does prosperity process that you've been, and I asked you over breakfast, and you told me you're going to answer this question later. So I ask you to here, how do you feel that the focus of prosperity advances the struggles of the communities with whom you've been working with? The key concerns, the key kind of priorities and advocacies that you've been advancing, how does that process and the indicator of prosperity that you've been generating, how does it feed into those ongoing struggles?
Thank you so much to all the groups. I have 2 points connected very much to the previous comments and also questions, and also to some of the comments by Kombe. If I understand it well, what I see is that common to all is this intention of repopulating, recharging some terms, whether it's poverty, not so much extreme poverty, or prosperity, and triggering some new ways, new content to the way in which these terms travel through different agendas, scales, level, and so on. And you are saying, actually, yes, it might sound that prosperity, when defined on the ground, more or less has the same elements or ingredients as justice or well-being and many other things that, no, many other terms seem to have. But what you are saying is, well, but actually the parting point and the value of departing from prosperity is not so much that we want to force-feed this term, but the fact that parts of the world are talking about prosperity. And so we want to repopulate, we want to bring a non-economic and more progressive content to that discussion. So my question in that, if that is the objective, it seems to be that then it's very important to see how this newly populated content of the notions travel to different scales. So for instance, I was thinking, if you are doing all this exercise and saying, okay, this is what prosperity means for local communities living in formal settlements in Dar es Salaam, and it's a fantastic work, and we can see all the dimensions, then how does that repopulated definition travel outside the community? And this could be applied to many other contexts, because I think that most of you somehow highlighted the need for curating the traveling, and seemed to have this objective of somehow there is a traveling, there is a role for a broker, if you wish, of a notion that has to travel. No? We want to spin a definition, but also make it travel. So if you could take us through that, how are you planning to make it travel to different ways, these more progressive and context-specific definitions. The second point I was thinking refers more again to the issue of transdisciplinarity and knowledge co-production. And so I was thinking, perhaps if you could reflect on whether you see all the themes made reference to a very strong reliance on knowledge co-production. And sometimes that was conflated with the idea of transdisciplinarity. In my view, there is a difference there, because in a transdisciplinary research approach, in this case, what we call the community or the communities or community members will ask the question, not only answer the question. Yeah? In this case, it sounds very much that we come with certain questions and then we populate them again with content and so on, using participatory methods. So I just want to understand if we are talking about knowledge co-production as something that happens when we use participatory methods, or where we lean to something more transformative that is also opening the questions that we're asking in research.
Who's going to volunteer? Everyone's looking and not. Who wants to kick off in responses from the panel? Schweib is smiling at the top. Schweib, do you want to start? Yeah.
No, because I wanted to make a reference to the comment by Alex, because as a matter of fact, there has been for a long time several terms that has been referring to the same question, so how to advance. So for us, actually, the intention was not to take it for granted that this was a universal term that should be translated into our reality, but we were actually trying to catch up with a very specific situation. That is that suddenly a term that has been traveling in the, we could say, the citizen's affair in everyday life. So when the end of the year comes, people always desire for the next year in Cuba health and prosperity. So the word is there in the communities. And suddenly, at the economic level, the term also starts to appear. So obviously there is a tension in that area, and it's not clear. It is not clear that there is a matching between these two perspectives. So when talking about equality, it is then obvious that these two dimensions has to be understood, because in our case, it is actually, we think, the fact that this element emerged in the political level, it has to do with the fact that many of these new tools that were generated were the result of a very strong participatory process at the national level. So looking for pathways for equality in our case is necessarily looking for pathways of prosperity towards equality. And for that, we assume transdisciplinarity as an approach to co-production, because, I mean, maybe in a practical way, because we had already experienced, actually under the direction of Joyce, several projects in which transdisciplinarity was understood as a tool to make room for different actors. So it was not interdisciplinarity, it was not multidisciplinarity, but transdisciplinarity understood also as the opportunity to give participation to actors that are coming from the community level. In this case, it takes a different shape, because the community approach based in these 4 case studies assumes a much stronger role. And as a matter of fact, it's actually something that we have been postponing, because we have always felt that we need a stronger preparation in order to face these processes, and this is precisely the trajectory that we have been following up to now.
Sorry. Sorry, I just want to add to this point of this last point. First, we are not looking for universally, and that's why we want to address this case study in order to make a broader view of what means prosperity for urban equality. And that is important for us because Cuba achieved before this equality in a sense. And that means it's a really an opposite process that maybe in the other cities are happening. Then for us, transdisciplinarity is a kind of co-production, but at the same time, is a kind of way to look for decisions where the people can participate a little bit more than before. During the 60 years, the people have been participating in different ways, but now the people want to say what to do, not only wants to approach different things, but they want to create in the community, or they want to create in another levels. Then there is another hope of make something more. Then prosperity maybe means much more than we expect it means for the people. And then I think transdisciplinarity allows us to make an analysis with the knowledge that is embedded in the communities, in the different communities, and at the same time to allow the government to gain more knowledge about what is happening, not only in the communities, but in the universities, in the different actors that are involved in the discussion of the city, that is very important in this moment. Actually, we have not a lot of things from the city to the decisions. Then we have to include these notions in the political agenda, I mean in the policies. And this is what No wants to do in this sense, in the different levels.
I know we're slightly going over, but we did start slightly late. So if we can all just be slightly more patient, we'll hear from everybody. I want everybody to have a chance to respond to some of the questions, and then we can move on to coffee. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, so I think Schweib was going to say something. So can we go to Schweib first, and then move on to you guys?
He go first? Right.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to add on Jorge's response to Alex's question about universality of the notion of prosperity. And I haven't really put my head into the literature around this, but what I'm going to say is very much a personal and highly opinionated reflection of, based on the experiences that I think, without giving a yes or no, I think this is going to continuously be a debate about universalism around prosperity. And it just, when you asked your question, you reminded me of one exercise we did about 4 months ago, about 4 to 6 months ago in the community, where we did a translation of the SDGs in the local context. And it was very interesting. I was trying to pull up the image of the new banner that we created. And I don't remember everything, but there are two translations that I remember. On goal number, the goal on climate change, 13, the translation of that goal was take action on climate change. So cutting all the debates and the discussion about, physical science, the drivers of climate change, impact and adaptation and vulnerability and the risk, and then the mitigation, the community's understanding of that goal was simply take action on climate change. No matter how, at whatever scale, simply take action on climate. That for me speaks to the contextualization that is most likely going to emerge when we have a proliferation of literature on prosperity from different economic perspectives and socioeconomic perspectives. So I think it's going to continuously be a debate without saying yes or no, but I doubt that, this is the personal opinion, I doubt that there is any kind of universalism around the notion of prosperity. and just like well-being, the discussion on well-being as well. It is. And then very briefly, to respond to Vanessa's conceptualization, very tough and challenging question about sustainable development and climate change context. But again, a few things come to mind looking at your, thinking about your question, and that is the goal number 11, inclusiveness. The word, if you could underline the word inclusiveness and opportunities. I'm not sure in the targets there is a mention of opportunity in one of the targets, but it doesn't come out explicitly. But as earlier mentioned, it could have been crafted in this room. But the point, we had a lot of discussion around moving away from the traditional measurement of development, which is highly quantitative, to outcomes and progress towards something. And one of that something was opportunities. Now, when you go deep into opportunities, it means that you will most likely not unify the economic or social opportunities. There will have to be equitable distribution of resources, equitable distribution of income, which is another thing that is part of the discussion of equality. But I think that inclusiveness in SDG would help us to contextualize, frame prosperity in whatever perspective that we think of. And with the climate change context, again, you bring back risk, because how do you, in a very climically dynamic world, how do you actually ensure prosperity when there are a lot of uncertainties about the climate risks? I mean, not to mention the bushfires in Australia, not to mention the droughts in Africa, droughts in Latin America, now the Indian diapole and the impact of that on Africa, unusual precipitation and rains that are happening across the entire African region. How do you ensure prosperity when you have these kind of episodic impacts that with a high degree of uncertainty? That is going to be a very challenging and difficult question to contextualize prosperity within the context of climate change. Thank you, Chair.
To our case, I think maybe I just explain more about why we select this case for the fishermen in the city, right? Related to the prosperity, right? Of course, we have global thinking about that very clear. But in fact, if we go to the people, it's different people that have different perspective, because that is not wrong. That's not wrong for the city. The prosperity, that is the GDP. Prosperity, that is the big city. That's prosperity with the money or everything, right? But to the science, it's different to local people and some other thing. But the key thing is the resource. The resource is the nature, the ocean, everything. Now it's going down. The second is the education. The third is the health and some other thing. So how we fit this one? If we not go with the people that lived there long time ago. The fishermen built the city. So we go back this one. We build back this one. The capacity in different approach. Approach now is that they have to do that, right? They're not telling you go to do, or we're not going to tell you to. They have to do that. We build the environment for them to do that. We have a lesson learned from the young people. The young people from the fishermen, they move away because of no fish, no money, no everything. Now they're going back because of conservation. Their father making back money by jewelry, by everything. So they want to back. But the problem when they back, they have no knowledge of combo. So we have to fish the people. Now the people going up and prosperity come to everyone, to the country. So that is what we thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to respond quickly about the question which was asked by participant about how do we interrogate or linking the findings which we are really getting from the prosperity into the day-to-day kind of struggle of the community living in informal settlement. I think one of the major findings that we are really getting on is that it has been a great more understanding within the community about elements which they could also be to do in order to address aspect of poverty within their neighborhood. And this has also increasing, helping them to start up some initiative like starting saving schemes, because they know that now by having saving schemes and the federation network within their neighborhood, that's where they can be able to get resources, they can get loans from the community neighborhood and start up their own businesses. But apart from that, there has also been increasing understanding that there are other issues which are environmental aspect, which they are also affecting their health. They are also affecting their pathway to prosperity. Such issues like solid waste management within their neighborhood, aspect like sanitation, aspect like clean water services. So all these initiatives right now, the community are able actually to see the linkages about the lack of these services towards prosperity issues. And within this kind of work, we have now seen kind of community getting up voices to actually demand for their rights. In our case, we normally have some financial support from the municipalities, which is normally geared to support the women groups or the youth groups within the neighborhood. And we have seen now increasing, these kind of support are now coming to support the community. So there is a great linkages actually between the study and what is coming on the ground. And the study itself is really helping a lot of more understanding and knowledge. There was another question about how does the now information travels. It's true that once you do research like this one, and then if there's no any dialogue, no opportunity for presentations, it means that knowledge is being locked. But what we are intending to do actually is to arrange series of dialogues and meetings, not only at the municipality level, but we want to ensure even the national level officials who are engaged with economics and development for the nation, they also come and hear these kind of findings. And we believe that through those dialogue, that's where we can influence changes and more understanding with different stakeholders.
Also, I wanted to respond just quickly on the process so that I can answer Adriana's concern. We started with explaining the meaning of Maisha Bora, or the good life, the community. From there, we had like 2-day workshops where the community came up with the following questions to get that concept from their colleagues. So questions like, what are the things that are hindering factor for them to have good lives? Came from the community. What are the opportunities they see from within their neighborhood and from their municipalities that can lead them to have good life? Came from the community. So the whole process from those questions. Again, who to be interviewed? Because for the first phase, we had like a focus group discussion. So the community listed groups of people that will be attending the focus group discussion. Bear in mind that there are some people who won't be able to speak when you mix them with other group of people. So the community, they had now to list type of groups and participants in those groups of focus group discussions. So we ended up having 6 groups in each settlement with different participants. For example, tenants were just group of tenants. Landlords and landlords are in their separate groups. The entrepreneurs and the women that are not engaging in any activities, they're in their separate group. Why? Because the community themselves, they say that when you mix these people together, some they may afraid to speak or they won't be free to speak when they are mixed with others. So the whole process is from the community themselves, from the scratch. And I think on what Professor Kombe was mentioning, it was very strange. We can think maybe to improve people's life is, for example, building hospitals. But communities, sometimes they won't be able to access get some health services because of the cost. So the issue is sometimes people want to access health services by having low cost. And I think we can think maybe to have building some schools. But communities during the focus group discussion, we are not talking about schools, but the quality of education for their kids. for example, the parents. So you can think about building schools, but if the quality of education that is provided there is questionable, community won't be happy.
Let's do. Everybody wants to get tea and coffee. Before we go, can we thank the 9 people for the great presentations and all the discussants as well? Thank you very much.